You are watching the Geldcast update. Today we're going to talk about two very important research conferences that took place last week. One in Frankfurt at the European Central Bank at the ECB and one in Zurich at the Swiss National Bank. I would like to answer the question, what differentiates these two research conferences from each other? What can we learn from one important paper that was discussed at the ECB Research Conference? And I also would like to give you a closer look behind the closed doors of the Swiss National Bank's Research Conference. This is the Geldcast update.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
Some of you might have realized this is a new format. Some of you might know the Geldcast talks if you don't know them. And if you do speak German, please have a listen to the Geldcast talks as well. I interview 12 times a year experts in monetary policy in my Geldcast talks. This is a 30-minute talk format. This one here, the Geldcast update, is 5 to 15 minutes, and I would like to give you some background information about what is happening in the monetary policy scene, and I would like to give you some news as well. Now let's talk about the research conferences at the ECB and at the Swiss National Bank. Let's have a listen at the ECB's research conference.
Hello and welcome to the European Central Bank's 8th Annual Forum on Central Banking. My name is Claire Jones. I'm a journalist for the Financial Times and I'm going to be your moderator.
Well, now let's have a listen at the Swiss National Bank's research conference. Yeah, nothing. That's no mistake that happened here. It's really nothing. There's nothing online that we can find from the Swiss National Bank's research conference. The research conference of the Swiss National Bank is really taking place behind closed doors. And the big question, of course, is that a good thing? Why should the public not be involved in the Swiss National Bank's research conference? When I was at the University of Bern, I had the chance to talk to some people who were responsible for the Swiss National Bank's research conference, and I confronted them with that thought, like saying, why do you not open it up? And they said, it's very important that we can discuss very openly at the Swiss National Bank's research conference. If the public was listening, that would be a problem because then we could not say exactly what we were thinking. Of course, that really is typical for the Swiss National Bank. It's a very closed-up central bank. It's not transparent at all. I checked the numbers actually before the show, and they usually have 2 press conferences a year, which contrasts to 8 press conferences at the ECB, for example, and also 8 press conferences a year at the Fed, at the US Central Bank. Also, the Swiss National Bank does not publish its minutes. The ECB does it, the Fed does it. It's kind of standard to publish them. The Swiss National Bank does not do that, and that intransparency often is criticized, but it also has some advantage. I want to point out 2. There are many, I guess, but I want to point out 2 of them. One is that you can discuss very openly within the Swiss National Bank's governing board. You do not have to be afraid that the public will pick up that, let's say, the Vice President Fritz Zurbuch said that, and Andrea Mechler said that and that. So that does not happen if you're kind of intransparent, right? And that's actually a good thing, because before the lifting of the minimum exchange rate vis-a-vis the euro, that was in 2015, I know that they had been talking about potentially lifting it at some point prior to that. Now imagine the public had known that they were actually discussing to discontinue the minimum exchange rate. That would have been a problem, right? The markets would have gone crazy. And that's really good that they didn't go crazy, of course, and that is partly due to that intransparency of the Swiss National Bank. A second advantage of not having a super open or super transparent central bank is that you can talk with one voice to the public. It's not that the public realized that Fritz Zurbuch, for example, the vice chairman, wanted something different from the president, who is Thomas Jordan at the moment. So this is really good. You can speak with one voice, and you do not have these cover stories saying Fritz Zurbuch versus Thomas Jordan and what's happening at the Swiss National Bank. So I think that's really the second big advantage of having some degree of intransparency at a central bank. But the Swiss National Bank is under a lot of pressure to open up a little bit, especially from a group called the SNB Observatory. Ivan Lengwiller is a professor at the University of Basel, and he founded that group together with 2 colleagues. And he says the Swiss National Bank should really open up a little bit now. It's really time to do that, because he himself, as a monetary policy expert, does not really understand why the Swiss National Bank came to that conclusion or that policy action. He says it would be helpful for the Swiss National Bank to enter the political debate, because then it would be easier for the Swiss National Bank to make clear why they did discontinue the minimum exchange rate, for example. If you like to know more, and if you do speak German, then I encourage you to listen to episode number 10 of the Geldcast Talks. In that episode, I talked to Ivan Lengwieler about his proposal. Let's now turn back to the ECB's research conference. They're really explaining what they're doing policy-wise, and they also let the public interact with its researchers, with the researcher they invite to the research conference. And I think there you can really see the benefits of having a public and openly accessible, at least, research conference. Online you can find 8 hours of live streams from the ECB's research conference, and I actually watched the entire 8 hours. And there was one paper that was not really presented actually at the research conference of the ECB, but a paper that was published during the ECB research conference and which gained a lot of attention. A lot of people were talking about that paper during the ECB research conference. It's written by Jeremy Rudd from the Fed, from the US Central Bank, and he basically says, like in a nutshell, we don't know anything about inflation expectations, and that's why we should not talk about them so much. The starting point here is that central banks are kind of obsessed with inflation expectation, because the dominating theory says inflation expectations really drive inflation. If inflation expectations are high, if you guys out there expect prices to rise in the future, prices will rise today already. That's why central banks are so obsessed with inflation expectations. That's why they're doing so-called forward guidance. They talk about where they want to go with their policies in order to influence inflation expectations, hoping that would actually affect inflation as well. So the theory says inflation expectations are key, but this guy, Jeremy Rudd, says, no, that doesn't work. Inflation expectations are super stable, they don't move. And Andrew Bailey, he asked the question, he is the governor of the Bank of England, and he took the chance to ask a question to one of the most well-known inflation experts in the world, who is Francesco Lippi. And Bailey asks him, so what do you think about that paper of Jeremy Rudd? Should we not talk about inflation expectations so much? And he mentioned a survey from England that said that people didn't even know what their inflation expectations were. So they're not moving at all. In academia, this is sometimes called rational inattention. They don't pay attention to inflation. That's why they don't have inflation expectation. And he asked Francesco Lippi, what do you think about that? Let's have a listen here.
There is a lot of evidence that shows how inattention depends on the inflation regime itself. It is, in some sense, one of the comforts of living in a low inflation world that we can ignore inflation. I don't look at the ECB reports every quarter. I'm sorry, Isabel. But the reason I don't look at it is that I trust the ECB. I know I do not expect big surprises. But if I were to move to Argentina, I will look at it much more often. So rational inattention is not something that is inherent to an agent's DNA. Agents are not born rationally inattentive. They decide or they learn to be so in an environment that lets them do so. So I think these are great.
So this is Francesco Lippi speaking here in the background, really an expert on inflation and inflation expectation. And he says inflation expectations are important, but they're not so important in Switzerland, for example, and in Europe, because we here in Europe and in Switzerland, we can afford not to really think about inflation, not to form inflation expectations. And that's why they're so stable. Central banks have a hard time here in Europe to influence inflation expectations. And he also says whether or not we pay attention to inflation and inflation expectations depends on our monetary regime that we actually have. So if you don't have an explicit role for inflation expectations in your monetary policy strategy, then obviously people don't pay attention to it. If you had an explicit role for inflation expectations, that might change, right? He mentioned Argentina, which is very different because they have very high inflation rates. But take the US. The US introduced a new monetary policy strategy in August 2020, in which inflation expectations have a much bigger role. But enough from the nerd content, from the nerd sides for today. I promised you some information about the Swiss National Bank's Research Conference, a closer look behind the closed doors of the Swiss National Bank's Research Conference. And I was there a couple of years ago because I wrote a paper with Daniel Kaufmann from the University of Neuchâtel. And the research conference is really great. You have lots and lots of very great discussions, especially after the presentations ended, right? Presentations are always a bit exhausting. You have to pay a lot of attention. You have to think hard the entire day. You drink many coffees. You're wearing your suit, even though it's really hot in the room and outside, because it's usually in September. So that's kind of the downside. But the upside is the dinner. At dinner and prior to the dinner at the apéro, you have a lot of great discussions with people from the SNB. You can talk to them. You can talk to people from the governing board at the Swiss National Bank. And I think that is really great. Of course, you sleep at the famous Paradeplatz in Zurich in a 5-star hotel, which is also great. It's not what I usually do, but it was a great experience. Of course, one thing is there are a lot of men at monetary policy conferences in general. More than 90% of all presentations at the Swiss National Bank's research conferences since 2007 were held by men. But going back to comparing the two research conferences, it's equally bad at the ECB. They have had research conferences since 2014, and their share of male presentations is 85%. So there's a long way to go, but it's getting better. At the Swiss National Bank, we had 25% of female presenters this year, and at the ECB was 50%. All right, that's it from the first Geldcast update. Thanks for listening. Follow me on my YouTube account. You can find the Geldcast update on my YouTube account. There is more to come. Tell other people if you like that show, and thanks for tuning in.